Hello everyone. There are a couple of familiar faces over here. So I presented on the same topic, I think last month. So I hope you guys would get bored, but I've tried to change. It's just a minor change here and there. But otherwise, hopefully you guys have thought over it and maybe have some interesting questions.
Let me add my 2 cents on this.
Yeah.
Why I repeated this session, okay? Now, when we did it last time at Microsoft, the topic was actually VR and gaming, and we had 2 this. One was this, and one was Girish's on HashiCorp. And since RootCon came up, and this is basically on DevOps, I found your session was very relevant for this crowd, okay? What I thought was the way you bought it, the things that you experienced. I felt, in my opinion, that this will be very helpful for you guys. Okay, so that's why I'm repeating this session. So it's good for you guys, so you get to know what's happening. So there's everybody's saying, okay, DevOps, you find, hello world, everything chalta hai, but usually it's not. There are a lot of scars and wounds for you to show up, and that's what also the previous Sujans was. And anybody who do DevOps will always tell you that. So I think so. There's a good topic which I'm thinking about. I think what he's faced, how he's the topic. That's a good thing. So go ahead.
Alright, so a little bit about me. I work at a company called MediaSting, which is an online advertising exchange. So we deal with, it's kind of similar to what one of the verticals for DirectEye, but we are primarily a native advertising exchange. So that would mean that the ads that you see on websites, which are similar to the look and feel of the website itself, it doesn't seem like an ad. It's like you have like Amazon products, you are browsing through the products, one of them is a sponsored post. So the only way to distinguish it's an ad is just by that small sponsored keyword written over there. So we work on building an advertising platform which caters to primarily delivering such sort of ads. Our stack is, we are a Golang shop, and we are hosted on AWS, and it's a very small team, so we are still kind of taking baby steps in automating our way through it, using wherever we find DevOps, the DevOps side of things. We don't have a DevOps team, so as an engineer myself, whenever I find myself doing something which is repetitive or error prone, I pick up and add a small segment here and there. But so this, whatever I'm speaking about, is through my experience over here and in the past, where I've actually worked with deployment for large scale systems. So I start off with a couple of suggestions. So this is an opinionated talk, and when I say suggestions, I mean stuff that I felt I picked up from bad experiences with time. Now, how many of you are, I'm sure most people are working with distributed systems, so how many of you are on distributed systems, are building distributed systems today? Okay, so you guys have monoliths. What is the idea like? Alright, so everyone talks about microservices at this point, and microservices typically means that you clearly define and demarcate your service boundaries, you identify your control logic, you identify your business logic, you create them as independent services so that they don't, so that you are able to scale each as and when required. You are not dependent on creating, if it's an entire one large monolith, then you scale the entire thing just because there is one specific bottleneck. So to avoid these sort of problems and to maintain easier practices for development, when you have a distributed team and you have microservices, then guys can work on different parts of the system without breaking each other's applications. So to have this sort of a culture, you started this practice of maintaining microservices in your production system. Now for to have this, a lot of people create multiple GitHub repositories, whatever, wherever is your source code. You create multiple repositories, and then with time it becomes one repository is dependent on another repository, as in code is, there is a dependency which is required. And when initially it works smoothly, but as your team grows, you start facing problems here in the sense of you version, you pick up a package which is there in another, package A and repository A and repository B. You pick up, you have a dependency from repo A, and that your application is built on that. Today, it's fine, it's a small team. Tomorrow, when distributed teams come into the picture, you create your build pipeline, repo A has been updated, and your code breaks, and it's hard to determine why. So this is a very common problem. So the way to avoid it, and even to maintain, when you talk about continuous integration and delivery, you create build pipelines at a later stage. So when you do that, you can have, if you have a single repository, you can build your artifacts in a manner that the lowest level dependencies are built first, then they are injected into the next level, and so on and so forth. So when the moment you do something of that sort, you are able to ensure that your system is always stable and it is up to date. It also ensures that if I am maintaining repository A, so now it becomes like a package in my main repository. And the moment I make a change, the moment I commit it, the other stuff is going to fail. So it ensures that if it's a major release, I create backward compatibility. I still support the older APIs. So the idea is everyone treats their package, whether it's internal or external, you treat it as if it is exposed to the public. And when you enforce this sort of a mentality on a developer, the quality of code improves drastically. So the idea should be to maintain, to write code in that sense. So a monorepo is a single repository across your organization with guys having specific folders maybe for their requirements. But with time, you'll find that it's easier to grasp what your system is doing at any point in time. And it also ensures that you find culprits at an organization level, in the sense that there are people who have the tendency of checking in anything and everything into the repository. Large database files, which are static files, instead of being fetched from a remote source at an initialization script for during deployment, it is checked into the repository because it's harder to put a relative path and run it. And when you do that, your Git repository size increases drastically. It goes over 500 MB, over a GB, and source code shouldn't go that way. And you talk about versioning this, then it increases even more. So your .git folder becomes the major, the entire your fetch script while deploying causes massive problems. So to avoid all this, a good idea is to define standards across the organization, and you have like vetting and linting tools which run in your build pipeline. So when the moment a code is checked, certain rules are run across your program. So it is run, it's a standard guideline that is defined by any organization, and it is run across any code committed in that repository. So you maintain standard practices. Another thing is Git flow. So when everyone has their own idea for deployments and maintaining Git, the branches, what is a feature branch, what is a there are some repositories which have 30, 40 branches. Everyone's doing their own line of work. Fine. When you deploy it, everyone's creating their own binaries and putting it up. So what is the stable state at any point of the system? At any point in time, it's hard to determine. So the idea should be that, what I found is Git flow. When I say Git flow, I mean that I create master, and master always reflects production, no matter what. Then it's up to you whether you want to have a system where you create feature branches, or you want to have like the GitHub model where individual developers create their pull request, fork the repository, work on their independent repository and create a pull request. That's up to you. But master of the system should always reflect production. Then you can have a feature, if you're going by the feature branch, which usually organizations tend to pick up, you can create a feature branch, and you can, when the moment it is releasable, that time you merge it with master, it runs all your, there'll be a master. Then if you're going by the feature branch approach, you'll be creating a development branch. You'll merge your feature branch into development. Your entire state, whatever test cases, your performance benchmarking, whatever it is, everything will be run on that. Once it gets a green signal, then it will be merged to master, and your entire deployment now will reflect the new master. So master becomes your production, your development becomes the next best thing to master. So where you evaluate and you push out your releases. Then there are always cases where there are small bugs which come into the system every now and then. It doesn't fit into a feature. So the idea is that it's a single day's job. So a good practice there becomes you have another branch out of master called hotfixes, which is the standard term, and you fix your bug there and merge it back with master. It runs everything and it pushes it out. So hotfixes is just for fixes. It shouldn't be abused to create features there and roll it out. But the main takeaway from this is always keep your master reflecting production at any point in time and always keep it stable. Then overall design simplicity. So microservices is like a good way to analyze microservices. Like if you read about it's blogged about extensively in today's world. So if you read about Uber's microservices, they have over 1,000 microservices running as an independent services, which are then scaling independent, based on their own requirements. But you'll find after doing that, then there are some articles where some guys have written, okay, we made a mistake there. We took anything and everything we required as an independent service and we scaled it up. But it wasn't really the need of the hour at that point. So when you talk about microservices, I feel at least most of us are not dealing with, for starters, we are not dealing with Uber scale. So in our world, I feel you should be able to talk about your entire system architecture in 10 to 15 minutes. When I say you should be able to talk about your system architecture, I mean you should just be able to create a few blocks saying that this is one service, this is another service, this is how my service, this is how my services talk to each other. The moment you can do that, and so you have your entire system in your head at any point in time, it means your system is designed well, and that would be a good way to work with microservices. Now configurations. All of us need configurations in our whatever is our code that we are running. When it comes to configurations, a big no-no is always having any configuration checked into your repository, in the sense that hard-coded config should never be there. That's a big red flag. That should always be avoided. Now, when it comes to executables, most of your applications always have one final executable which is created, which triggers your entire flow. Now, if it is a command line executable, I generally like having command line flags as arguments, which then either inject the variables that are required through the environment variables, or I can override them through the flags. So it gives me flexibility as a developer. When I'm developing, I don't have to always rely on my system, my environment variables. I can always inject and point it to local file system points, but I'll be ensuring that it is always driven through a configuration. Another practice is to never ever check in your config file into your repository. It should, even if you check it in once, then you should ensure that you can't just delete it and get rid of it, because it's still there in your Git history. So the idea should always be, if you have done it by mistake, then you'll find like GitHub has a blog on how you should delete a trace of a file. So you have to not only just delete the file and make a new commit, you have to delete the entire history, or you update your secret keys, whatever it is. But never have any configuration variables entered into your repository. A good practice I found is having every program that you run, every service that you run has an entry point. It's whatever it is. It's a web service, it's a system, it's a tool which runs in the background, whatever it may be. Every program has an entry point, and it's like function main for most cases. I find so my idea is that if your service is supposed to do something, then your function main starts off. Your function main validates all the environment variables it needs. When I say function main validates, I mean right at the start. Before it triggers the execution, it at least validates if it has all the variables that are required for the successful execution of the program. The reason I say this is because there are times when I create a web service which triggers a certain handler at a random point in time for whatever reasons. Now, when I say handler, I mean that there is an API endpoint exposed, fine, but on a certain condition, it executes some logic. When that happens, say that logic is expecting an environment variable, and randomly that gets triggered, and your app, and it's not found in your system, and it crashes. So when your service is launched successfully, you're not able to certify or say it with confidence that it's working correctly, because there might be as simple as an environment variable being missed out. Your service is not stable. So a good idea is always to have your function main read whatever variables are required, maybe inject them into the handlers that are required. But and if main doesn't find the variable, it should fail right then and there. It helps me as an engineer, because right then I don't have to, like if I have started it, it's stable according to whatever was my design spec at that point in time. Secrets, if people aren't comfortable with environment variables, there is another thing, that is, if you create a package, and now I don't know how many are doing it as open source, but if you have environment variables and say another package consumes you, then if they also call the same environment variable, they have the ability to, because it's in the environment, they have the ability to read the variable that is defined by your service. So even though you are not exposing it out of your environment, but just because someone else is consuming your service, they have the ability to pick it up because they are consuming the service. Now, in those cases, using a secret injection mechanism, like something like what HashiCorp's Vault is there, you should have a look at how you maintain secrets, how you create organization level access, how you ensure that only certain guys have access to a certain set of variables, only permissions and all that. So I would suggest exploring Vault once and give it a look, because if your entire infrastructure, if your entire services are hosted only on your system, then environment variables works well. If you want to plan to expose it, or you're planning to consume third party, then using something like Vault would be the way to go.
Especially so when you're speaking, right? When you do presentation, the guys have noticed, okay, the open day and the environment, the SH keys, everything out there. Vault is really good at that point.
Everyone's been talking about like monitoring has been used a lot. It's what's required for especially for a DevOps engineer. Application engineers tend to ignore it, and now they are slowly started getting into the habit of of monitoring their systems, but they are not doing it at system level. They are doing it for application level metrics. So there are different approaches to it, and there are tons of tools out there, like you mentioned Nagios, and Datadog also does something like this. So we have been using like Prometheus and Grafana, so both are open source, and for us that's worked well. Now the entire idea of recording metrics is, if you're talking about your environment, those sort of metrics would be different in terms of what is the CPU consumption, what is the RAM memory consumption, what are the error rates while consuming, what are the disk reads, all that. That becomes one specific set of metrics, which becomes resource level metrics. Now when you talk about application level metrics, it means that I have a web service exposed. Every time I receive a request, I increment a counter for the request received. So whenever you have instrumentation systems, they are always time series database backed systems. So the idea is that you should be able to create or retrieve results for queries like how many requests did I receive in the last 1 hour, how many errors did I record in the last 1 hour. So the moment you can take this, there's no end to the kind of innovative queries you can come up with. You can always devise interesting stuff like what is like my request latencies. You can talk about error rates. Everything is done. So there are two standard mnemonics which are used, like RED and USE. So RED would be for application metrics. So RED is for when you define services. A good idea to get started for any service is to monitor the request rate, the error rate, and the durations for those requests. and with time you'll find that you are able to gauge the overall stability of the system. The use mnemonic is for your resources. So if you are using queues, for example, so the utilization of those queues, the saturation, when I say saturation, it means that like if it's a queue, you have messages inside your queue. Now messages that are, and it's a queue, right? So it has a limited capacity at the end of the day. So saturation means there are so many messages which are waiting to be fed into the queue but haven't been able, because of the data that's already in there. So measuring something like saturation, measuring the errors that are thrown by the resources. So use is another mnemonic which is handy for measuring the resource utilization of your system. Graphing tools, like I mentioned Grafana, so graphing tools are whatever instrumentation tool you use, it records metrics with time series. Now when I say time series, it means that at any point in time it can tell you what was the value for that particular resource. And when you have a graphing tool, it plots that with time. So you should, like you can create last requests per what is my behavior over a week per day. You can create something like that, so then you can see what is the average, the number of requests that it's receiving, number of errors that you're receiving, all those sort of things. What are the durations of your API requests, all that sort of information. And does anyone use Prometheus over here? Okay, so Prometheus, the reason I find, rather I like Prometheus is because the way it works is it's a pull mechanism instead of a standard push mechanism. So when I say something like that, it means that I have my service which is running. My responsibility is to expose an endpoint from that service. Now I'm talking about application level metrics. All I have to do is expose an endpoint from my service. The Prometheus service runs independently, and based on a duration that I define through a config file, it pulls, so it calls my service at that interval and pulls the data at that point. Now the power that this behavior gives me is that unlike the standard push mechanism, which would mean that the moment I receive a call, I increment a counter and send an API call again to my Prometheus server. If Prometheus worked in a push mechanism, that would mean that for every API call, I fire a call which updates the counters at some location. Prometheus reverses that logic. It creates a handler in your application which only responds to this get call which the Prometheus server makes. So you by changing the push to pull mechanism, you save a lot of network I/O. So you should have a look at Prometheus if you get a shot. And generic dashboards across services. Now, if you use Prometheus and if you use, the idea is to always have a graphing tool or some sort of a dashboard sitting on top of it. The moment you have dashboards, it means you again can take application type of metrics and you can take resource type of metrics. A good practice in an organization would be that you define certain resource type of metrics that are standard across. It doesn't matter what your service is. You don't care if it's a user profile service or it is a database, it upload photo service, whatever it is. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, monitoring what is the disk use, for example, what is the CPU usage. These sort of metrics is common across all services. So creating a generic dashboard and making it a rule so that any new service that is deployed in your organization should import this dashboard. So when you have a DevOps engineer or someone who's monitoring the infrastructure, at least he's got one familiar aspect of the system that he can have a look at any point in time. So this should be ideally driven not through the engineer who's writing the application, but through the engineer who's going to monitor the application at all points. Because what are the numbers that they look for? Every application that is deployed in the organization should expose those numbers. Because like even Srujan had mentioned that he doesn't care about how the application is implementing its logic. At the end of the day, he's only concerned about how it's using its resources. So if he creates standard guidelines and he exposes a dashboard which implements all those guidelines, then making it a mandate to be used across all your services helps a lot. So this is like one, just to give some idea, this is a Grafana dashboard. So it just, there are certain like traffic rates and CPU usage and disk usage and all that. So you can I was talking about when I spoke about generic dashboards, I meant something of this nature. Because this isn't bound to the service that has been deployed, it's bound to the resources that are being used by that service. Now, logging and error handling. I don't think there, so this is again a very opinionated subject. What should be logged? How should you be handling errors in your application? Now, from what I have realized with time is, number one is not to have independent applications or independent services having their own mechanism for logging. Don't let the application have a specific behavior, because now tomorrow if I import it as a package, I am bound to your behavior. Then if you say that I am going to write to Elasticsearch and I am going to create a database, I am going to create a log object with this request object, response object as a part of it, and some timestamp, you define your API contract, then tomorrow if I use your package, I'm supposed to import it, I'm supposed to create the object that you have specified based on your thinking at that point in time, and then I'm supposed to import it, which is not required, which doesn't help me at all. So a good practice for logging would be to log to standard output. Every application, every service that you're running, let it log to standard output. Any package that is importing, so whenever you have services that are consuming packages, let your main service, let your function, main, whatever it is, whichever is the main service for your tool, for your web service, whatever it is, let that decide how logs should be treated. There are a lot of solutions which are able to stream. At the end of the day, standard output means it's writing to the stream. So there are ways to stream that to a file, to stream that to another store. Like for example, Elasticsearch, Logstash Kibana is like the most widely used open source tool available for logging. So you stream your standard output, redirect it to some other location, whatever it is, Fluentd, whatever is convenient, Datadog if you want. But there is a mechanism to do that. So a good idea would be to have all your applications write to standard output. Structured logging and level logging. So there is structured logging is if you feel that you have information that is actionable, in the sense that you should always first of all log for humans. Don't, unless it's one of those logs which are read, which you pass to maybe a message queue, and some other service picks up the log object and acts on it, which is fine. That becomes a machine level log. But if you're talking about most cases, logging is done for humans. So keep stuff that is pertinent to a human being. Don't log anything and everything. Don't log the entire request object, response object, all the objects that it encountered on the way with one stack trace. It becomes, you're logging so much data. Logging also is a cost in your service response time. Logging, very rarely do people write logs in an asynchronous call. People generally write a log statement right at the end of the function. That's the most common practice. You forget that when you talk about file streams, you talk about everything, it's a stream at the end of the day. You might write concurrent programs, you will have different spread across multiple threads, but all of them need the same access to the standard output. You are holding a program over there. So don't log unnecessarily. Log only actionable information, log only stuff that is going to be helpful. When I say structured logging, I mean like having a JSON object, for example, such that you have standard fields which are, which can be indexed by a document store. So if you have ELK, for example, you can index on, timestamp. You can index on the request structure, whatever it is. So you have that flexibility. Level logging would be logging at level of info, debug, warning, error, all these sort of levels. Don't go crazy over there. You decide what, if it's log, if it's a fatal error, your application crashes. Don't log fatal and then carry on with your application behavior. It's not fatal. So each word has a meaning. So you should be aware. If you're logging a statement, your application should crash. Then that's it. So another thing is warning. I don't get why people use warning. If it's either it's a problem that you have or you don't. Writing a warning, is that going to help anyone? I mean, you just put up a warning there and it's just there, it just clutters up your log. No one takes any action on a warning because it's working without it. So get rid of warning logs. Keep errors you talk about, you keep errors and you keep info or debug, you choose whatever you want, which should be turned off in production. And it needs to be turned on only when you face specific issues, and that time you can turn it on for a while, view those logs and turn it off. That's why level logging is great to have, but always keep it config driven. And yeah, main point being, don't go crazy with the logging. Now, when it comes to error handling, you figure out how you want to handle errors and you keep a practice there. Don't handle the error in a form of logging something over the moment you encounter it, and then wrapping up the same error, throwing it up the stack. The guy who's there at the next level again receives the error, acts on it, and then throws it up. When you read logs, it becomes cluttered again because you're seeing the same damn thing over and over again. So get rid of that behavior. Don't make errors repetitive. And now when you're talking about web services, ensure that your web service at no cost exposes any internal error. That should be caught at whatever. There should be some handling, there should be some sort of mechanism or some handler which is sitting on top, which ensures that even if there's a mistake made at the lower end, the topmost layer gets rid of the error, maybe logs it somewhere and says that this needs to be fixed, but maybe throws out only an internal server error as the API. So you maintaining this sort of a practice ensures that your service doesn't behave randomly. I mean, these are some guidelines, because when you talk about creating services, you write error handling and everything will be fine. Someday someone might miss it, and it ends up in getting exposed to the public. So always ensure that there is a handler right at the root level which avoids these sort of scenarios. When you talk about distributed systems, you always have multiple servers responding to different calls spread across different regions. So maintaining a distributed trace ID is always a great idea. So the moment you receive the request, you create a trace ID and inject it across your API call, so that you can then later on index a trace ID. You click on a trace ID, you'll get all the calls with their timestamps for that trace ID. So you're able to trace the path of a request. So maintaining a trace ID helps in a great way. And can be driven through metrics is when you talk about large scale systems, logging isn't going to help you, because you are not going to be able to cope up with the scale. It's just going to be a lot of information. So driving your entire error tracking also through, instead of driving it through logs and seeing, okay, there are so many logs being tracked for this error, drive it through metrics. Create counters for specific errors. If there is your parsing error in the request, for example, then create an error for error parsing request and increment the counter every time it is encountered. When you view it on your dashboard, if there is a spike, you will know that there's something wrong. Create an error for database connection failure. If the database connection failures are common, it happens. There are usually retry logics implemented. So you will find it there 2 to 3 times and then it works fine. That is fine. If there is a spike, so if you use metric driven error handling, then you'll find that spikes are normal, but if there is a sudden surge, then there's something's wrong over there and it's time to investigate. So driving error handling through metrics is also a great idea. Now testing. How many of you write test cases? And how many repositories are there where you guys are working where there are no tests written?
Actually, only applying unit tests, integration tests, I'm not doing that. That's a better question. At least your component you're testing, that is important.
Yeah, actually. So testing is, I feel that it's, especially the guy who starts writing code, the first guy who creates the repository and starts writing the first level, if he doesn't write the test cases, then the entire culture gets driven in a manner that whoever comes up is always just fixing whatever is required or just adding a feature. And writing test cases later becomes hard. The moment you talk about writing test cases, if you think, like I'm not going to say do TDD. TDD is used a lot, and TDD is something which is, it's like a unicorn. It's very idealistic world that you write test cases for everything, and then you write, and then every test case fails, then you keep writing code to make those test cases pass. and at the end of it you have minimum code to cover minimum test cases, and that should complete your application. That's a beautiful concept, but it doesn't really work out in reality. So instead of having TTD, I would at least talk about having, whatever you're writing, make it testable. The moment you think about writing test cases for that, you end up creating, end up allowing something like dependency injection, so that your application can pick up, it is driven through an interface, so it picks up a mock implementation instead of picking up the standard implementation. It enforces good design. And when you enforce good design, writing code to allow testing helps in the sense that it helps create those levels of abstraction across your application. So creating test cases is great. Using mocks, so there are different types of test cases. There are unit tests, there are integration tests, acceptance tests. Unit tests become like when you write a function, whatever is your package, for example, anything that is exposed out of that package should be tested. Now when you write a unit test, you should test out independent functions that are exposed by that package. And another practice is that don't, if say it's an API call test, now if it's making an HTTP GET, then it's writing to a queue, and then it's writing to something else, and then it is finally expecting some response. Your test case, which is going through this logic, shouldn't be failing if the HTTP GET fails. Now, so a call to the HTTP handler should be driven behind a mock implementation. So you ensure that when you read this particular test case, it passes. If it passes, it means that your desired behavior is passing. If it fails, it means that there's something wrong in the logic written there. It shouldn't imply that HTTP GET failed, so your test case failed. So the moment now you talk about abstracting code in this level, it becomes a major challenge in terms of it's not easy. It increases your development time to a great extent right at the start, until it then becomes a habit. It's a big cost at the start, but it helps your organization a great deal. It improves the code quality to a great extent. So ensure that your test cases are meant to do what they're supposed to do. Integration tests would be when you're integrating with third party. So you are importing a third package, you are working with a black box. You test your API calls to that particular thing, and that's it. So integration test is something that you won't run every time, because if you are writing a test to establish a connection with a MySQL database, you don't need to run that every time because that's a heavy call. Now, with the use of Docker extensively, there are different practices that people follow while testing, and the usual case is, okay, I have a layer in my application, I'll write mocks for my dependencies, I'll test out using those mocks. So independently, I'm able to certify that each layer is working as expected. But I'm not writing end-to-end tests, because that would mean that basically I have to mock the entire layer. So, and that doesn't really signify the quality of my application or stability of my application. Now here something like Docker comes in very handy. The way I like to think about it is in the sense that if I have a MySQL database, for example, which requires records, and once in a while creating a small, either a snapshot or a smaller level copy of my production system, and I spin up a Docker container for my test. With a MySQL instance, I write my entire database, mock a production level system into that MySQL database, and then treat it like an end-to-end production call, so that I run a call which will not pick up any mock implementation. It will go through the flow as expected, but because I know that MySQL has this record, my cache Redis has this particular entry in its field, I know that it's supposed to pass. So the main idea is people say that, okay, production system is, we are not going to test on production, but we are not able to mimic production. So I feel a good idea is to spin up these Docker containers when you require. You add these records in your Docker container at initialization level, and then you run an end-to-end test. It helps again towards a great deal. Performance benchmarking is like after testing. Another thing that very few people do is benchmark their system performance. How many requests can your API handle? that, like he had mentioned earlier, that you increase the number of CPU cores, you increase the RAM. But why? Do you know how many cores does your CPU require? Do you know how your application consumes those cores? Are you using only a single core, creating 30 cores, and it's not going to improve your performance if you're using only a single core. So you should know what is the breaking point for your system. You should know the thresholds. So writing good performance benchmarking tools helps in establishing numbers and establishing the quality. You should, as an engineer, you should be able to certify the level of your deliverable. Orchestration is when you talk about concurrent, when you talk about a single request, you receive a request and you have inter-service dependencies. There are multiple ways to handle inter-service dependencies. One way is to use it as an external package, but the problem with an external package is you're bound to that particular package. Now, if that guy updates it, then you have to update a binary somewhere, which creates problems at times. So it's easier to implement that particular dependency as a service. Now, as a service, you can make a call over HTTP, but a good idea is to use something like gRPC, so over an RPC call. But the power that gives you is you're not bound to the internal behavior of that particular service. You are only bound to the API contract. And I believe that if you are creating a service contract, even the guy who has built a package and exposing a contract will then, a contract is written in stone is like one way to see it. So the moment you say that, okay, this is what it's going to expose, I'll ensure that I don't break it. So using it as making RPC calls is a good idea to consume external services. Message queues ensures that I am able to stuff that I don't care about in real time. I'm able to push to a message queue and let it work in an asynchronous manner. There can be different services which push some data to maybe S3, for example. Uploading to S3 is not required in your real-time flow of the request. So you write to a message queue will accept the request, and then you don't have to wait for it to actually perform a successful write on S3. So using message queues helps in compartmentalizing your services. It helps you create service boundaries, and it helps you loosely couple your systems. So it's a good idea. Service discovery has been mentioned extensively anyway. So service discovery, the moment you talk about spinning up containers, spinning up instances, and not hard coding any IP entry, any config which shouldn't be there. So you will need a service discovery mechanism to identify what is the IP address of the machine that you are concerned about. So maintaining service discovery tools, using a service discovery mechanism always helps in microservices. Don't over-engineer. Now, there was a quote by Microsoft engineer who said that there was a time when we treated our servers like pets. We used to give our servers names, and if they fell ill, then we used to nurse them back to health. Today we treat our servers like cattle. We just give them a number. The moment they fall ill, we kill it. So that's what it's become right now. So you don't really care. Like, the general idea is either restart the service or just kill it and spin up a new service. Now, if it's a large-scale organization, it's fine. But usually when you see startups, there are enthusiastic engineers who want to learn stuff. So from day one, I don't care if I have a traffic. I don't even know how many users are going to get on board, but I'll prepare for scale. So I'll create a Kubernetes cluster. Why? So you need to create a cluster only when it is required. Now, a good way to think about that is that if you are able to name your host names at any point in time for your services, if you're able to, you have multiple servers running. If you're able to name your servers, and when I say name, I don't mean server 1, server 2, server 3. No, I mean that actual proper host names, because your architecture is that small. Then you don't need a cluster. The moment that goes out of hand, the moment you're not able to keep track of how many instances you're running for anything, at that time, getting into an orchestrating mechanism like Kubernetes makes sense. So don't, because it's a big moving part. It's a part that requires a lot of maintenance. So don't get into it right at the start, because there's a difference between a hobby project and running systems of production. The moment you create something, you're creating a dependency for an organization. It might be your hobby. You might like it, but tomorrow, first of all, you may not be there in that organization in a couple of days. So what happens then? I mean, some other guy will have to break his head over Kubernetes just because it's there. And it's not required. He's got one instance running. Why do you need Kubernetes? Single node cluster, what sense does it make? So think about it before getting into, that's where you keep it as your hobby project. You try stuff out, no doubt about that. But don't just keep implementing things in production directly. So you decide when you need to have a cluster mechanism established. Continuous integration, delivery, and deployment. The moment you check in code, you ensure in your Git flow, whatever you have a CI server set up. So whether you use Travis CI, you use Circle CI, whether you use most people tend to use Jenkins. Otherwise, I don't know if anyone's tried out Drone, but have some sort of a continuous integration server set up, and ensure that you build at any time there's a commit. You can ensure that when there is a commit then you can go and take it. So I'm talking about taking it step by step. So you have a build triggered and run test cases and verify that it's stable for anything. Then the moment it's maybe pushed to development and it's merged with development, then maybe you can go and push it to you can have a deployment setup which is pushing it to your dev servers. If there is for master, maybe if there is a release that you cut, like in GitHub you have a release, right? You can draft a new release. So you can have an event which is listening to a release, to a tag which has been cut. So the moment a tag has been cut, it goes and deploys it to your production. So you can use all CI servers give you webhooks which listen, and GitHub or any GitLab, whatever it is, all of them expose these events, a tag, a build, a commit, whatever it is, it gives you certain events. So using these events, using the branches that it's been run on properly, just using a rule-driven, a simple YAML file, you can do a lot. You can have basic setups too, you can have extensive setups, but a simple rule file is all you need. So find whatever is the right fix for you, find whatever works for you, but always ensure that you have something set up so that no one should be going and manually building the project. Blue-green deployments is again something which comes at a larger scale, in the sense that you have you push out a new release, you redirect traffic to the new release, and if something's not right, you go back to your old deployment and you find out what's wrong. So that means that for a certain period of time you have 2 deployments running on production. Some people cannot afford this as a cost, so for them maybe usually it's not required at that level, but for larger scale systems, blue-green deployments is always a great idea. Phasing out your releases is in the sense that you do it in an iterative manner. You don't push out a major release across all your consumers. There is, like, people have A/B testing. Similarly, phasing out your releases is how does Google or Facebook roll out a feature? You'll find Facebook, for example, a tweak in the newsfeed goes out to a certain country. It goes out to a separate region. It slowly makes its way to the entire world. So something like that, when you talk about phasing your releases, you pick up a consumer with lower traffic, you push out your release there, see how it's behaving, verify the stability, fix whatever is required, and then you move towards a larger scale. Knowing your numbers is the same point that I mentioned earlier, that you should, at any point, you should be able to talk about the threshold of your system, the hotspots of your system. You should be able to say that my server with this much CPU, this much memory can handle so many requests. In under ideal conditions, so many requests per second. It breaks when there are so many use cases that arise. Having these numbers allows you to scale and then in a proper manner. Now, if most young organizations don't have enough funds anyway, so or they might have too much. So if it's too much, then it's scary because people go overboard in resource allocation. You'll pick up the largest servers when your application is very small, and everything works fine, but you don't need it. So you identify what is required in that sense. You pick up a small, it's easier, it's better probably to have something which breaks and then you increase scale rather than have something which is massive. You don't know what's going to fail when. And and you're just living in, like, you've created a massive cushion out because you have got, deep pockets. That's not a good idea. At least forget the business side of things. At least as an engineer, you shouldn't want to settle into something like that. You should want to identify how much a system can take.
Excuse me, could you give me some insights on how you go about doing that in terms of your current setup would break?
Like when I talk about, if you take a web service, for example, and it can be as simple as you deploy a web service on, you take an instance, whether it's a DigitalOcean Droplet or an AWS T2 Micro, which is free. You take it up. After that, you fire, even if you do a simple benchmarking, like you pick up JMeter, for example. You fire so many concurrent users, so many requests per second. You'll find how many requests per second your system can handle. Then you know what is the traffic. You also somewhere else have numbers for how much traffic your service is actually encountering. You know how many users are there for your system. Do you need, is T2 Micro going to work for you, or do you need an M4 large? So my main point being that especially if a company has money, I've noticed that people say something like, I've used a bigger instance, I don't have to worry about anything. But so it might work. But I'm saying as an engineer, figure out what is the value that is actually required for you. And like in talking in terms of like the AWS stack, I would say, like, if you have a micro, then you define auto scale policies. You can create an auto scale group. Maybe you don't need an M3 large, but you need 2 T2 micros. So you define an auto scale policy, you define your threshold, you trigger an alarm, you spawn a new instance, attach it to your load balancer, you do all that, but you keep it at a limited scale. So I'm talking about in general services. If you just doing API calls and using performance benchmarking tools, you are able to identify how much load your system can handle. So mainly it is a part of load testing. Now, when you talk about rolling it out, you have SLIs, SLOs, SLAs. So SLI is a service level indicator. So it's any metric that is measurable. So it's like, how many requests it can handle per second, how much load, as in what is the error rate per hour. All these sort of indicators, anything that is measurable for your service. SLOs becomes objective. So SLO is actionable on SLI. So that means your objective, every product should have its own set of objectives. Okay, my objective is that I'm going to keep my error count less than 30 per hour. It might be a good SLO for someone, it might not be a good SLO for someone else. So you identify what are your objectives. I'm going to keep my request latency to this value, below this value. Some people have objectives as my uptime of my service is going to be it's going to be up 99.99999% times. Like if you look at a Netflix SLO, they'll say something like their uptime is like 5 nines. A Google search has even more nines added to it, whatever it may be. SLA is a service level agreement. That means your consumer can take action on whatever is the SLO. So you say that as an agreement, I'm saying that my my service is going to give you a performance of so and so milliseconds as an average latency at any point in, across a day. Now, if it's an SLA, that means if you break it, you are responsible for it in the sense that so SLAs are mostly in cases of like financial consumption. So if you break some contract there, it becomes a contract, it's signed by parties. So if you break a contract there, you're generally supposed to reimburse the amount that is lost. Stuff like that comes into the picture. So SLAs are when it's written in stone. SLOs are defined for yourself, or it might be defined for an engineering team itself. It might be defined at business level. You have to decide what works best for you. But it's a good idea to have something clearly, stated, listed out somewhere that these are the things that I'm going to ensure when I'm running my service on production. Pager duties is like you have alarms which are triggered when there is use based on the use case or the amount of usage. Don't go overboard with that. If you have a single alarm that's if you fire alarms only when it is actually critical, that's a great idea. If you do it for, oh, the CPU usage has gone above 30%, you fire an alarm. You treat it as a notification, but tomorrow when it goes, you won't pay attention when it has actually gone over 90%. So ensure that you're like what I found as a good idea was like at the start I created a lot of alarms. And then with time I see that, okay, this is redundant, I cut it down. I get rid of certain notifications which I don't need. I increase the thresholds for these alarms accordingly. So you find what works for you, but ensure that something that is critical, you don't end up missing out on it. So create alarms accordingly. Auto scale policies, right, is the point which I had covered earlier, which is don't go overboard in the sense of, just picking up large resources. Secondly, you should do some analysis on when you need to scale. When it is, you'll find like when your average CPU consumption goes over 50%, or should it be when your maximum CPU consumption goes over 50%. There is a lot of difference between average, minimum, maximum word being used over here. So find what is working for you. Don't create a policy which says that when my CPU exceeds so and so amount, spawn up another instance. And there is another policy which says that when my average goes below this amount, cut out one instance. Your policies will keep fluctuating and intersecting. Don't have that sort of a system set up. So you clearly define, you will have to spend some time, you'll find some, either a drop down or a text box to enter numbers there. But do some calculations before writing these numbers, because it means, it defines how much cost you're going to incur. The moment, like when you're talking about AWS, the moment you spin up an instance and you shut it down and you spin it up again, you're charged, the moment you turn it off and turn it off, you're charged for an hour, because that's the minimum value. So if you're fluctuating like this, you're going to be charged for you'll be charged for so many hours. And it's all because of the policy that you've defined. So pay attention to what you're doing when you're defining autoscale policies. And use automation to keep improving would be that you find behavior. This is something which would come with time. You will find that you do something, your certain actions become repetitive. When you see this alarm, you end up going and starting a service. So instead of restarting the service, maybe you can automate that. Maybe on receiving an alarm of this specific type, you write a shell script which automates the restart of that service. Maybe it shuts down a container, restarts the container, whatever it is. But all this, I mean, don't be in a situation where you find yourself repeating the same action over and over again. The moment you see that you're doing something once, twice, thrice, and you're doing the same thing without even batting an eyelid, then that would mean that it's time to consider automating it or redesigning somewhere. So, a lot of it is in terms of your perspective and how you see it, because things will work either way, but it just eases out the workload a bit. So, and it ensures stability to a greater extent. Yeah. That's it.
Cool. Thanks.